July of 1963 arrived in Deaf Smith County, Texas, the way punishment arrives without announcement, without apology, and without any intention of leaving soon. The sky above the panhandle turned the color of old bone before 8 in the morning, and the heat pressed down on everything beneath it with the particular cruelty of a season that had already taken more than it was owed. Harlan Bowen was 61 years old, and he had been reading this land since before most men his age had learned to read anything at all. He stood at the edge of his northeast field in the hour before full sunrise, his boots planted in soil that no longer gave beneath his weight. 32 years of walking this same ground had taught him to feel the difference between earth that was tired and earth that had given up entirely. This morning, pressing the toe of his right boot into the cracked surface of the irrigation ditch margin, he understood that what lay beneath him had crossed that line sometime in the night, or perhaps sometime last spring, and he had simply not let himself name it until now. The cracks ran 3 inches wide in the worst places. Harlan crouched down the way a man crouches when he already knows what he's going to find, but understands that knowing requires the courtesy of looking. He pressed 2 fingers into the largest fissure near the ditch wall. The soil came away in his palm dry as cornmeal, no grit, no structure, no trace of moisture whatsoever. He let it fall. The dust settled before it reached the ground. He stood back up and looked at the sky. The sky offered nothing. 32 years on this land had given Harlan Bowen a specific and private kind of knowledge that had no name in any agricultural manual he had ever read. He knew the way moisture smelled 3 feet underground in April, a mineral coolness, almost sweet, that rose through the cracked clay on certain mornings before the sun got high enough to burn it away. He knew the exact pitch the wind made when it came down off the Llano Estacado, carrying nothing behind it, different from the wind that carried rain by a half-tone that he could not have described to another person, but would never mistake. He knew this particular field, these 340 acres that his father Roy had handed over on a March morning in 1931, with a set of tractor keys and an instruction to disc the south pasture before supper, the way a man knows a face he has looked at every day of his adult life. What that knowledge was telling him this morning was not something he wanted to hear. The Ogallala Aquifer, which his pump had drawn from reliably since 1947, had dropped 11 feet in 2 seasons. Merle Haskell, who ran a well drilling operation out of Hereford, and who had worked every farm in the county long enough to know which operators asked the right questions and which ones preferred comfortable answers, had driven out to the Bowen place in March and stood beside the pump housing with his arms folded and delivered the news in the flat, unhurried way that men in his trade learn to deliver things that cannot be softened. Another dry season, Haskell said, and the static water level would drop below the reach of Harlan's existing pump. The pump would pull air. The irrigation system would stop functioning entirely. The replacement pump alone would cost $2,200. Harlan did not have $2,200. What he had was a $14,000 operating note at the First Territorial Bank of Hereford, secured against the land itself, due in full by October the 15th of that year. The note had been structured in 1959 and rolled twice since then, each time at terms that had seemed manageable in years, when the aquifer held and the grain prices cooperated. This was not one of those years. This was the year the aquifer did not hold and the grain prices did not cooperate, and the irrigation ditches that ran a combined 100 feet across the northeast quadrant of his property were bone dry by the 2nd week of June. 60 acres of grain sorghum stood in that northeast field. He had planted it in late April with the reasonable expectation of a growing season that looked nothing like the one he had received. The sorghum was dying, not struggling, not stressed, dying in the particular way that plants die when they have reached the point of no return, and the only thing left is the time it takes for the visible evidence to catch up with the biological fact. Without water, that crop would be dead inside 10 days. The land had been in the Bowen family since 1908. His grandfather Ezra had broken the first acre with a mule team and a borrowed plow. His father Roy had expanded it through the Depression years by working a second job at the grain elevator in Hereford and putting every dollar he saved into the soil. Harlan had spent his entire adult life on this ground. His son Leland had been born in the farmhouse at the east end of the property, in the room that still had the original wood floor his grandfather had laid by hand. What happened if this season failed was not abstract. Harlan knew exactly what it looked like because he had watched it happen to other men's land, and he understood with complete clarity that there was nothing special about his situation that would cause the outcome to be different from what it had been for every other family that had stood in front of a banker with more debt than income and no realistic path between the two. The bank would begin foreclosure proceedings. The land would go. All of it. All 55 years of it. He looked at the cracked field one more time. Then he turned and walked back toward the house. He did not speak to anyone until he reached his own gate. On the morning of July 11th, Harlan Bowen drove his 1957 Ford F-100 into Hereford and parked in front of the Deaf Smith County Agricultural Extension Office on a street that had the tired, sun-bleached appearance of a town that had been waiting for rain long enough to stop believing it was coming. The man behind the desk was Aldous Ferrick. He was 43 years old, held a master's degree from New Mexico State University, and had occupied the county extension agent's position for 11 years. He was a careful man, methodical in his record-keeping, and consistent in his recommendations. He was not unkind. He was something more limiting than unkind. He was certain. Ferrick listened while Harlan explained the aquifer drop, the failed irrigation, the 60 acres of sorghum dying in the ground. He listened without interrupting, which Harlan later recognized as the professional courtesy of a man who already knew what he was going to say and was simply waiting for the appropriate moment to say it. When Harlan finished, Ferrick pulled a type form from the top drawer of his desk and slid it across the surface with the practiced motion of someone who had performed this action many times. The form was an application for drought relief assistance through the USDA's Agricultural Stabilization and Conservation Service. The minimum processing timeline for a drought relief application in Deaf Smith County, Ferrick explained, was 14 weeks. The sorghum would be dead in 10 days. The banknote was due in 96. Ferrick leaned back in his chair. He folded his hands in the particular way that men fold their hands when they are about to say something they consider to be reasonable and final. With aquifer levels what they are this season, Ferrick said the Extension Office recommendation for producers in Harlan's position was to fallow the affected acreage and apply for set-aside payments through the ASCS program. Harlan looked at the form on the desk. Set-aside payments on 60 acres of dryland ground would yield approximately $4.10 per acre. On 60 acres, that came to $246. His note to First Territorial Bank stood at $14,000. He said nothing for a moment. In the waiting area behind him, he was aware of two other men sitting in the plastic chairs against the wall. Sid Harlow, who ran 600 acres of dryland wheat on the Fiona Road north of town, and Vern Oakes, who leased county land near the Playa Lake south of Hereford, and who had been farming that ground for longer than either of them cared to count. Both men had heard everything. And the note, Harlan said. Ferrick unfolded his hands and refolded them. That's between you and the bank. He said it without malice and without apology, which was somehow worse than either. He said it the way a man states a fact that he considers settled and does not see any purpose in revisiting. Harlan sat for a moment longer. He picked up the ASCS form from the desk, looked at it without reading it, and set it back down. He stood. He did not say goodbye. He did not shake Ferrick's hand. Behind him as he walked toward the door, he heard Sid Harlow shift in his chair. He did not turn around. But he heard the sound clearly, the small adjustment of a man who has just had something he already believed confirmed, and who is settling into that confirmation the way a person settles into a chair they know will hold them. Harlan pushed open the door and walked out into the July heat. He drove home on US 60 with both windows down and the hot panhandle wind moving through the cab of the truck with the indifference of weather that has no opinion about any of this and never will. He did not stop for fuel. He did not stop for coffee. He drove straight through Hereford and out the other side and turned onto the county road that led to his property, and he did not speak to anyone. He parked the truck beside the barn. He sat in it for a moment with the engine off. Then he got out, walked past the barn, past the equipment shed, and around to the back of the property where an old grain bin had been converted into a farm office sometime in the 1930s before Harlan had taken over the operation. The conversion had been his father's work, a potbelly stove in the corner, a plank desk, 2 shelves of binders and ledgers, and a single window that faced east toward the field where the sorghum was dying. He went inside and closed the door. The cracked leather satchel had belonged to Roy Bowen since before Harlan could remember. It sat on the lower shelf between a 1947 USDA soil survey and a binder of equipment warranties that Harlan had kept updated out of habit long after the equipment they covered had been retired or sold. The satchel was not organized in any way that would make sense to another person. It held papers that Roy had considered worth keeping without necessarily considering them worth filing, things that mattered enough to save but did not fit into any existing system of categories. Harlan lifted the satchel from the shelf and set it on the desk. He had not opened it in several years. He did not need to look through it to find what he was looking for, because he had known where it was since the winter of 1951, and he had thought about it periodically in the 12 years since, with the particular attention a man gives to a piece of information that does not yet have a home. The document was near the bottom of the satchel between a hand-drawn property map from the 1920s and a carbon copy of a water rights agreement that had been superseded by a later filing. It was 12 pages of faded typescript on paper that had gone yellow at the edges and soft at the folds. The cover page identified it as a vegetation survey of the Southern High Plains pre-settlement species distribution and soil correlation conducted by Horace Dellum, botanist, for the Texas Land and Soil Commission in the year 1924. Harlan had read this document for the first time in January of 1951, 3 weeks after his father's funeral, sitting at this same desk in this same converted grain bin with the potbelly stove running and the January wind off the llano pressing against the east-facing window. He had read it carefully, the way his father had taught him to read anything written by a man who had spent time in the field, which was with the assumption that the field had taught the man something worth knowing. What Dellum had written about in those 12 pages was the pre-settlement vegetation of the Southern High Plains, the plant communities that had existed before the breaking of the sod, before the farms and the fences and the irrigation wells. Most of the document concerned grasses and forbs that Harlan already knew. But on pages 7 and 8, Dellum had turned his attention to a species that Harlan had not encountered in any other agricultural context before that January afternoon in 1951. Salvia hispanica, chia. Dellum's field notes on the subject were precise in the way that good botanical observation is always precise, not merely identifying the plant, but locating it in relationship to the specific conditions that allowed it to exist. He had recorded large-scale stands of wild chia growing along the seasonal playa margins across Deaf Smith Palmer and Castro counties. He had noted the soil composition of those playa margins with particular care: highly saline, low organic matter, extreme pH variance, and minimal growing season moisture. He had noted that this plant required no supplemental irrigation once established in sandy loam substrate. He had noted the seed yield per plant. He had noted the harvest window late October into early November. He had noted the caloric density of the seed and the fact that indigenous populations of the region had used chia as a food staple through periods of drought that would have destroyed any cultivated grain crop. And then the document had moved on to other species. Harlan had read those 2 pages in 1951 and thought about them in the way a man thinks about something he has no immediate use for, carefully enough to retain it, but without urgency, because the land had been producing adequately in 1951, and there had been no reason to reach for anything the existing system was not providing. He had thought about those pages again in 1957 during a dry spring that ended with June rains. He had thought about them in 1960 when the aquifer had first begun to show signs of depletion. Each time the conditions had not been quite extreme enough to make the reach necessary. In July of 1963, sitting at his father's desk with $14,000 due in 96 days and 60 acres of dying sorghum in the northeast field, the reach was no longer optional. He turned to pages 7 and 8 and read them again. Sandy loam substrate, no supplemental irrigation, harvest window in late October. He set the document on the desk and looked at the east-facing window. Beyond the glass, the panhandle light was the flat white of a morning that had already given up on clouds. The northeast field was not visible from this angle, but he knew exactly what it looked like because he had looked at it every morning for 32 years. He sat with Dellum's document for a long time. He was not a man who made decisions quickly, not because he was slow, but because he had learned from his father that speed in decision-making is most often a way of avoiding the full weight of what you are deciding. Roy Bowen had spent 40 years making decisions carefully and recording them in ledgers that still sat on these shelves, and the farm had survived the Dust Bowl and the Depression in 3 separate periods of commodity collapse because Roy had never made an important decision without first making sure he understood exactly what he was deciding. Harlan read the relevant pages of the Dellum document a 3rd time. Then he put it back in the satchel, put the satchel on the shelf, and went to bed. He drove to Amarillo on July 14th, a Monday, and spent $40 at the Amarillo Public Library over the course of an afternoon that lasted until the librarian told him the building was closing. He worked through 2 botanical reference texts and a 1958 Rodale Press publication on seed crops of the southwestern United States. He took notes in a small spiral notebook with a mechanical pencil, writing in the compressed shorthand he used for anything he needed to remember precisely. What the library confirmed was what Dellum had recorded 39 years earlier, stated in different language but arriving at the same conclusions. Chia germinated reliably in alkaline, low-moisture soil. It established quickly in sandy loam substrate. It required no supplemental irrigation after germination. Its root system was adapted to follow fracture lines in compacted soil downward towards subsurface moisture. Its harvest window was late October. 2 weeks after the banknote came due, close enough that a signed purchase agreement, if one could be obtained, might constitute a form of collateral. There was one additional piece of information Harlan carried, not from Dellum, but from the front flap of the cracked leather satchel where he had placed it in March. A wire story from the Associated Press reprinted on page 7 of the Hereford Brand, the county newspaper. The story cited a USDA commodity report projecting retail demand for chia seed at between $40,000 and $80,000 annually by 1965, driven by the emerging health food market in California and New York. The report noted 0 established domestic production. All current supply came from Mexico. Harlan had cut the article out and kept it. He drove home from Amarillo in the early evening with the notebook on the seat beside him and the Panhandle sky going red and orange behind him in the direction he was coming from. That night, he walked the northeast field at dusk, moving slowly along the irrigation ditch margin, with the cracked soil beneath his boots. He pressed his heel down into the largest fissure he could find and felt the resistance of the compressed crust, not more than 2 inches of surface hardpan, and below that looser material, the sandy loam that ran through this quadrant of the property and that Dellum had identified as the substrate chia had preferred in its wild state along these same playa margins 40 years before. He stood in the field until the light went completely. He was thinking about something his father had said to him once during a dry spring in the early 1940s, standing in this same general area of the property when the soil had cracked in a similar way after a dry winter. Roy had crouched down and pressed his palm flat against the cracked surface and said that the land did what it needed to do, whether you understood it or not, and the only advantage a farmer had over the land was the possibility of understanding it before it finished doing what it was going to do. Then Roy had stood up and gone back to work. Harlan walked back to the barn. He pulled the tarp off the John Deere Model M that had belonged to his father, the oxidized red paint still intact on the hood, the fabricated broadcast cedar attachment that Roy had built from steel channel, and a hand-crank spreader mechanism sitting on the barn floor where Harlan had placed it after the last oil change in January. He checked the engine. He ran it for 10 minutes with the barn door open and stood listening to it the way you listen to something you have maintained for long enough that any change in its sound would register before your conscious mind could name it. The M ran correctly, as it always ran. He consulted the green ledger on the barn wall. 32 years of maintenance records in 2 different handwritings, his father's angular script for the entries from 1931 to 1951, and his own smaller hand from 1951 forward. Oil changes, belt inspections, carburetor cleanings, all of it recorded with dates and part numbers and notes on anything that had required adjustment. The last entry was January 15th. The next scheduled oil change was July 15th. He was 1 day early. He did the oil change. Then he went inside, sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, and wrote out the seed order on a piece of notepaper. 12 pounds per acre, 60 acres at 18 cents per pound from a botanical supply house in Tucson, Arizona, whose address he had found in the reference section at the Amarillo Library. Total seed cost $129.60. He addressed the envelope. He put a stamp on it. In the morning, he would drive to town and mail it. Nora came into the kitchen while the coffee was still hot. She looked at the envelope on the table and did not ask what was in it. She had been married to this man for 34 years, and she had learned the way you learn things that are taught without words. That there were moments when a question was the wrong instrument, when what the moment required was not information, but the specific quality of silence that means I am here, and I am not afraid. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. They sat together until the coffee was gone, and the kitchen had gone dark except for the lamp over the table. Then they went to bed. The seed arrived 11 days later, packed in paper bags inside a cardboard box, and Harlan Broadcast seeded the 60 acres of dead sorghum ground over 3.5 days, running the Model M at 4 miles per hour across the cracked surface in passes spaced 12 feet apart, the fabricated spreader attachment distributing the seed in the particular pattern that Dellum's notes had identified as appropriate for this substrate in this planting window. When the seeding was done, he pressed the seed into the surface crust with a corrugated roller the M pulled behind it. He did not irrigate. He did not fertilize. He did the work alone in the flat July heat with the white sky above him and the cracked earth below, and nobody watching except Curtis Lane, who drove his pickup slowly past on the county road on the second afternoon and looked at the field and the old red tractor without stopping. When the last pass was done and the spreader was back in the barn and the M was cooling in the equipment shed, Harlan washed his hands at the outdoor spigot and stood for a moment looking at the northeast field in the last of the afternoon light. 60 acres of ground that the extension office had recommended he leave empty. Ground that held a $14,000 debt against it and 91 days to the due date. Ground that contained pressed into its cracked and alkaline surface $129.60 worth of seed that no commercial farm in Deaf Smith County had ever attempted to grow, that appeared in no USDA yield tables for the Texas Panhandle, and that a botanist named Horace Dellum had documented in precise field notes 40 years ago and filed in a report that had sat in a cracked leather satchel in a converted grain bin for 12 years before anyone had a reason to open it. Harlan dried his hands on his work pants and went in for supper. He did not tell anyone what he had planted. He did not tell anyone what he was waiting for. He simply waited the way a man waits when he has done everything that can be done, and the outcome now belongs to the soil and the season, and whatever understanding existed between a seed and the particular quality of earth it had been made for. The first week of August passed the way all weeks pass in a drought year on the Texas Panhandle, slowly and with a particular heaviness of time that has nothing to offer except more of itself. The sky stayed white. The soil stayed cracked. The irrigation ditches stayed empty, and the aquifer beneath them stayed where it was 11 feet below the reach of a pump that Harlan Bowen could not afford to replace and would not need if the thing he had planted in the northeast field did what Horace Dellum's 40-year-old notes said it would do. He did not go to check on the field every day. He went every 3 days in the early morning before the heat established itself, walking the rows with the same deliberate attention he gave to every other inspection on this property. Methodical, unhurried, without the kind of anxious hovering that changes nothing about the outcome and costs a man the steadiness he needs to respond correctly when the outcome finally arrives. He had learned this from his father, who had expressed it once in a single sentence that Harlan had never forgotten. A watched field grows no faster, but a worried man makes worse decisions. So Harlan did not worry, or rather he held the worry in the particular place where it could inform his attention without governing his behavior, which is the only place worry is useful to a farmer. He worked the rest of the property. He maintained the equipment on schedule. He repaired a section of fence on the south boundary that the dry heat had worked loose from its post anchors. He drove to the co-op twice for supplies and said what needed to be said and nothing beyond it. On a morning in the second week of August, Harlan stopped at Delmar's Feed and Supply on the west end of Hereford for a 50-pound sack of cottonseed meal. The loading dock at the back of the building was in shade at that hour, and 3 men were standing in it the way men stand in shade during a Texas August, not doing anything in particular, but doing it with the focused intention of people who have decided that remaining in a specific patch of coolness is the most productive activity available. Sid Harlow was one of them. Vern Oakes was another. The third was Curtis Lane, who farmed the section east of Harlan's property, and who had been there long enough to have opinions about every farming decision made within a 5-mile radius, including decisions that had nothing to do with him. Harlan nodded and went inside to pay for the cottonseed meal. When he came back out, Harlow was loading something into his truck bed, and Oakes was leaning against the dock railing, and Lane had his arms folded across his chest, in the posture of a man preparing to say something he has been thinking about for a while. "Heard you put something in that cracked ground," Lane said. Harlan got one end of the cottonseed meal sack up onto his tailgate. "Did he said, what crop survives in ground like that without water?" Harlan got the other end of the sack onto the tailgate and pushed it forward. "We'll see," he said. He closed the tailgate, got in the truck, and drove home. That evening, Vern Oakes told his wife that Harlan Bowen had finally lost the thread. He said it without particular pleasure, and without cruelty, just with the resigned certainty of a man reporting a fact that had been apparent to him for some time and was only now becoming apparent to everyone else. Curtis Lane said the same thing to his brother-in-law that weekend, and the brother-in-law, who did not know Harlan personally, nodded and said that was a shame. Word moved through Smith County the way agricultural failure always moves, not through newspapers or any formal channel, but through the accumulation of small conversations at loading docks and grain elevators and the waiting area of the Farm Bureau office on Thursday mornings. It moved quietly with a particular texture that was partly grief and partly something else, something that people in communities built around shared risk do not often acknowledge directly. There was beneath the sympathy a faint current of relief. Not that Harlan Bowen was suffering, but that the suffering was his, and that this particular season's worst news belonged to someone else's acreage and someone else's note at the bank. Harlan heard none of this directly. He did not need to. He had lived in Smith County for 61 years, and he understood exactly how these conversations moved and what they contained and what they did not mean. He went back to his fields every 3 days and checked what he had planted and said nothing. On the last Thursday of August, a storm system that had been building over the New Mexico border for 2 days finally crossed into the Panhandle and delivered half an inch of rain across Smith County between 9 in the evening and 2 in the morning. It was the first measurable precipitation since March. It came without thunder, without drama, just a steady and serious rain that fell straight down in the windless August dark and soaked into the cracked soil with a sound like something exhaling after a long time of holding its breath. Harlan woke at 3:30 and lay still for a moment, listening to the silence that the rain had left behind. Nora was asleep beside him. He got up without waking her, dressed in the dark, and went out to the equipment shed for his flashlight. He walked the northeast field before 4 in the morning, holding the light low against the surface of the soil, the way you hold a lamp close to something small you are trying to see clearly. He moved along the first row, then the second, then the third. His boots left prints in the damp surface crust. The air smelled of wet alkaline earth and something else beneath it, a green note faint and alive that had not been there 3 days before. On the fourth row, he stopped. He held the flashlight at an angle of about 15 degrees from horizontal and looked at the surface of the soil between his boots. There, running along the line where the seed had pressed deepest into the fissure, a pale film of color, not quite green, not quite gray, but something between the two that had no name except the name that mattered: germination. A surface change so subtle that a man walking at normal speed in normal light would have passed over it without seeing it. But Harlan was not walking at normal speed and the light was not normal, and he had been waiting for exactly this for 23 days. He crouched down, pressed his thumb gently against the pale film, felt the faintest resistance, the resistance of something that had begun. He stood up. He clicked off the flashlight. He stood in the dark northeast field for a moment, without the light, letting his eyes adjust back to the pre-dawn black of the Panhandle sky, and he breathed in the smell of wet earth and the green thing working its way up through it. Then he walked back to the house. He put the flashlight on the hook beside the back door. He went into the kitchen and put the percolator on. He sat at the kitchen table while the coffee brewed, and he did not write anything down, and he did not say anything to anyone because Nora was still asleep, and there was nothing to say yet that the outcome had not already said more precisely than he could. He drank his coffee. He went back to work. What Harlan understood, and what neither Aldous Farrick at the extension office nor any of the men at the loading dock understood, was that the drought had not simply failed to destroy his northeast field. It had done something more specific than that. It had prepared it. The same heat that had cracked the surface crust had driven the existing soil moisture downward, concentrating whatever trace of it remained at depths of 4 and 5 inches below the surface. The cracks themselves, 3 inches wide in the worst places, running 2 and 3 feet in length before branching, had created a network of open channels leading directly from the surface to that concentrated moisture. A seed pressed into the surface of that cracked soil did not need to push through dense, uniform earth to reach water. It needed only to extend a root into a fracture line and follow that fracture downward to where the moisture waited. Dellum had understood this in 1924 because he had observed chia doing exactly this in its wild state along the playa margins of the Panhandle. The plant had not arrived at those margins accidentally. It had been shaped by them over generations of selection, until its germination strategy was precisely calibrated to the conditions those margins produced: drought-cracked alkaline soil, concentrated subsurface moisture, hard surface crust that protected the germinating seed from the heat above while the root found its way to water below. What looked like damage was a delivery system. What looked like a ruined field was a prepared seedbed. Harlan had understood this from Dellum's notes, had confirmed it in the Amarillo library, and had watched it begin to prove itself in the pre-dawn dark with a flashlight held at 15 degrees from horizontal. But understanding and watching are different from knowing, and knowing requires time. And time was the one thing he had less of than anything else. The weeks that followed moved with the quiet momentum of a situation that has already been decided at a level deeper than the visible. The chia grew without announcement, without fanfare, without any of the outward signs that would have made it legible to someone driving past on the county road and looking at the northeast field from a distance. It simply grew the way things grow when the conditions have been correctly read and the right seed has been placed in the right ground at the right time by a man who understood the difference between what the land appeared to be and what it actually was. Harlan watched it from close range on his 3-day inspection schedule and said nothing to anyone about what he was seeing. In the last week of August, while the chia was still too small to be seen from the road, Harlan drove to Amarillo and spent an afternoon at the offices of Owen Marsh, a land use attorney whose name had been given to him by a contact at the county co-op. He brought with him the brown ledger, the companion volume to the green maintenance record that hung on the barn wall. Where the green ledger held 32 years of equipment records, the brown one held 32 years of financial history. Every loan payment, every interest charge, every piece of correspondence with the First Territorial Bank of Hereford, going back to 1931. His father had started it. Harlan had continued it with the same discipline because Roy Bowen had believed that a man who did not keep his own financial records was depending on someone else's accounting for the truth of his own situation, and that was a form of dependence Roy considered more dangerous than debt. Marsh reviewed the brown ledger for 2 hours. He reviewed the loan documents. He was a careful man, methodical in a way that reminded Harlan of Farrick at the extension office, except that where Farrick's certainty had closed doors, Marsh's opened them. What Marsh found was a pattern. The interest charges on Harlan's operating note for each of the 3 years from 1960 through 1962 had exceeded the maximum rate permitted under the Texas Banking Code, not by large amounts individually, but consistently across 3 consecutive years, in a way that accumulated to a total overcharge of $1,840. Marsh explained the remedy. Under the Texas Banking Code, a confirmed violation of the maximum interest rate provision required a mandatory credit of 3 times the overcharged amount against the outstanding principal. 3 times $1,840 was $5,520. Applied against a $14,000 note that was a different situation than the one Prescott Dunwell at First Territorial believed he was managing. Harlan thanked Marsh, paid his consultation fee in cash, and drove home. The following week, he wrote a registered letter to the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas, which regulated First Territorial's lending practices, outlining the 3 specific instances with dates and amounts and references to the relevant sections of the banking code. He wrote it himself in the same compressed hand he used for everything because the letter did not require a lawyer. It required the 32 years of documentation that sat in the brown ledger, and that documentation was his. He mailed the letter from the Hereford post office on a Tuesday morning. He did not mention it to Prescott Dunwell. He did not mention it to Nora. He did not mention it to anyone. He simply mailed it the way he had planted the seed, without ceremony, without announcement, as one more deliberate action in a sequence of deliberate actions that he had been building since the morning he stood in the cracked northeast field and understood that the only way forward was the one no institution in Deaf Smith County was going to recommend. By the middle of September, the plant stood 18 inches tall across the full 60 acres of the northeast field, blue-green and dense, their flower spikes beginning to show the first traces of purple that meant the reproductive stage had begun. Harlan walked the rows each morning at first light, his hands moving along the top of the canopy, checking for lodging the flattening of stems under wind pressure, and finding none. The root systems had done what Dellum had said they would do. They had followed the fracture lines downward, the tap roots going 4 and 5 inches deep into the cracked substrate to where the trace moisture persisted. The drought had concentrated that moisture, and the cracks had delivered it, and the result was a crop that was not merely surviving in conditions that would have killed anything requiring conventional irrigation. It was thriving, visibly, undeniably, in a way that was now apparent to anyone who slowed down on the county road and looked at the northeast field with fresh eyes. Some people did slow down, Harlan noticed. He said nothing about it and continued his inspections and kept his 3-day schedule and did not offer explanations to anyone who had not asked a direct question. He drove to Amarillo on the last Saturday of September. He parked at the Gulf Station on Interstate 40 and stood at the payphone on the east wall of the station with a number on a piece of notepaper, a number he had obtained from a trade directory at the Hereford Public Library after working through 3 directories and 2 dead ends over parts of 2 afternoons. Western Pacific Natural Foods, Los Angeles, California. The man who answered after the 3rd ring identified himself as Calhoun Vesper Purchasing. Harlan told him he was a producer in the Texas Panhandle with a chia crop in the ground and a harvest window in the 3rd week of October. He said he had approximately 900 pounds available based on a conservative yield estimate from botanical field data. There was a pause on the other end of the line that lasted long enough to be significant. Vesper said that Western Pacific Natural Foods purchased chia seed at 62 cents per pound in lots of 500 pounds or more. He said the company currently had no domestic suppliers. He said all existing supply came from Mexico and that the quality had been inconsistent, varying moisture content, variable purity levels, irregular harvest timing that made planting difficult. He said he would like to send a letter of intent by return mail. The offered price was 58 cents per pound for the full lot freight paid pickup at the farm. Harlan said that would be acceptable. He hung up and stood for a moment in the Gulf Station with the notepaper in his hand. Then he folded it, put it back in his shirt pocket, and drove the 2 hours home. The letter of intent arrived on October 3rd. Harlan read it at his kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with his 2nd cup of coffee. It was on Western Pacific Natural Foods letterhead, signed by Calhoun Vesper, and confirmed the purchase of the full lot of chia seed at 58 cents per pound, freight paid pickup at the farm. That afternoon, Harlan drove to Hereford and parked in front of the First Territorial Bank. Prescott Dunwell was behind his desk in the branch manager's office, a man of 50 with the bearing of someone who had spent his career in a position of local authority and had come to regard that authority as a natural feature of the landscape. He read the letter twice. Then he set it on the desk and looked at Harlan. "This is a letter of intent," Dunwell said. "It's a binding purchase agreement," Harlan said, "for a crop in the ground right now." Dunwell picked the letter up again. He was doing arithmetic. Harlan knew the arithmetic that the letter made unavoidable. 900 pounds at 58 cents was $522, against 14,000. He did not say this arithmetic out loud. Instead, he said that he would need to consult with the board about the bank's position, and he asked Harlan to come back in a week. Harlan nodded. He drove home in the October afternoon and went directly to the farm office and took the brown ledger down from the shelf. He opened it to the entries for 1960 and sat with it for a while, not reading anything. He had not already read, but keeping company with the record, the way you keep company with something that represents 32 years of careful attention and deserves to be acknowledged as such. Then he closed the ledger, put it back on the shelf, and went out to check on the northeast field in the last of the day's light. The plants were ready. He could see it in the way the seed heads hung heavy and dry, the purple color gone, now replaced by the gray-brown of full maturity. The smell had changed too. Walking the rows in the October evening, he caught the particular dusty sage note that Dellum had described in his 1924 field notes as the signature of chia at the peak of its harvest window. He stood at the edge of the field for a long time. The weeks between planting and harvest had been the longest of the season, not because anything was uncertain, but because everything that could be done had been done, and what remained was simply time. He had planted the seed. He had filed the letter with the Federal Reserve. He had contacted the buyer. He had documented the bank's violations across 3 years of careful record-keeping. He had done all of it quietly without telling anyone, without asking for permission or validation, or the approval of institutions that had not had the information he had. Now it was October and the field was ready, and tomorrow he would begin. On the evening before harvest, Harlan went out to the northeast field alone. It was past 10 o'clock. The sky above the Panhandle was clear and dense with stars in the way the Panhandle sky gets in October when the summer haze has finally broken and the air has thinned toward its autumn clarity. He left the flashlight on the hook beside the back door. He did not need light for what he was doing, which was not inspection and was not planning and was not any of the practical activities that had brought him to this field every 3 days for the past 2 months. He walked to the center of the 60 acres and stopped. The chia stood above his waist, black in the starlight, the seed heads heavy and dry. When the wind moved, and there was wind, a light October wind off the llano, carrying the particular cold edge that meant the season was genuinely changing. The seed heads moved against each other with a sound like very fine sand being poured slowly from one container into another. A dry, specific sound. A sound of completion. He stood in the field, and he thought about his father. He thought about the January afternoon in 1951, when he had found the Dellum document in the cracked leather satchel 3 weeks after Roy Bowen's funeral, sitting in the farm office with the potbelly stove running and the fields outside frozen and brown. He had read those 12 pages carefully, the way Roy had taught him to read anything written by a man who had spent time in the field. He had read the 2 pages about chia, and he had thought, this is something, and he had put it back in the satchel. 12 years. He stood in the dark field, and he thought about those 12 years, not with regret, because regret is a tool with no productive application at 10 o'clock the night before harvest, but with the particular clarity that comes from understanding something fully only after it has resolved itself. The document had been there. The knowledge had been there. But the question that the knowledge answered had not been large enough in any of those 12 years to make reaching for the answer feel like the only option. In July of 1963, the question had finally gotten large enough. That was not a failure of attention. That was how things worked. You kept the information because something in you understood it mattered, and you waited not passively, but with the active patience of a man who maintains his equipment on schedule and records every entry in the ledger and does not throw away a botanical survey from 1924 just because he cannot immediately explain why he is keeping it. His father had kept it. He had kept it, and when the moment arrived, it had been there. He stood in the field for a while longer, listening to the sound of the seed heads in the wind. He was not a man who prayed in any formal or demonstrable way, but standing in that dark field with the stars overhead and the weight of the harvest in the plants around him and the $14,000 note somewhere in the locked drawer of Prescott Dunwell's desk in Hereford, he was aware of something that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief and not quite certainty, but contained elements of all three. A stillness at the center of a situation that had not yet resolved a quiet that was not the absence of difficulty, but something that existed alongside it. He breathed in the smell of the field, dry, slightly oily, a faint sage note beneath it, exactly as Dellum had described it in 1924. Then he walked back to the house. He took off his boots at the back door. He went to the bedroom without turning on the kitchen light. Nora was asleep. He lay down beside her in the dark, and he was asleep within minutes the way a man sleeps when he has done everything that can be done and understands that the rest now belongs to the morning. The harvest began on a Monday in the 3rd week of October, in the kind of morning that the Texas Panhandle occasionally produces in autumn, as if in quiet acknowledgement of the summer it has just delivered, cool and clear the sky, a hard blue that had nothing in common with the bleached white of July, the air carrying the smell of cold distance off the Llano Estacado. Harlan Bowen pulled the Alice Chalmers Model 60 out of the equipment shed before sunup and ran it along the east boundary of the northeast field while the light was still coming in low and orange from the direction of Hereford. The machine was a 1953 model purchased secondhand in 1958 for $1,100 from an operator in Swisher County who was consolidating into larger equipment. It was painted the original Persian orange of Alice Chalmers' production, a color that Curtis Lane had once described as something a man would choose if he wanted people to see him coming from a long way off and decide to take a different road. Harlan had never repainted it. It ran correctly, and a machine that runs correctly does not require a new coat of paint to justify its existence. He had maintained the Model 60 on the same quarterly schedule he applied to every piece of equipment on the property, and the green ledger on the barn wall reflected this with the same density of entries as everything else. Oil changes, belt inspections, cylinder adjustments, all of it dated and noted and signed off in his own handwriting. The last full service had been in July, 2 weeks before he had broadcast seeded the northeast field. He had known when he serviced the combine in July that he would need it in October, and he had wanted it ready. He ran the machine through the first pass at the field's north edge and listened to the seed entering the grain tank. It sounded like fine sand against steel, A dry, continuous whisper that built as the tank filled, a sound entirely different from grain sorghum, different from wheat, different from anything he had harvested on this property in 32 years of harvest. He stopped the machine at the end of the first pass and climbed down and reached into the tank with both hands, letting the seed run through his fingers. Dry, slightly oily on the palm. The particular dusty smell of mature chia that Dellum had described in his 1924 field notes as reminiscent of sage after rain. He climbed back up and continued. He checked the tank by hand twice per pass, pressing his palm into the seed and lifting it to assess moisture content by feel, and to check for contamination, weed seed soil. Anything that would reduce the purity level that Calhoun Vesper at Western Pacific Natural Foods had specified in his letter of intent. What he found pass after pass across the 60 acres was clean seed at the right moisture level, consistent across the full field, in a way that suggested the growing conditions had been uniform enough that the entire crop had moved through maturity at approximately the same rate. Which made sense. The conditions had been uniform. Uniformly dry, uniformly cracked, uniformly alkaline, uniformly everything that conventional wisdom would have identified as reasons not to plant this field, and that Horace Dellum's field notes had identified 40 years before as the precise requirements of the plant, now filling the grain tank of Harlan's secondhand combine at 58 cents a pound. The harvest took 4 days. On the evening of this fourth day, Harlan weighed the total yield on the certified platform scale in the grain storage area and wrote the number in the brown ledger. 1,140 pounds. 19 pounds per acre across 60 acres. 3 pounds per acre above Dellum's conservative estimate. Well above the minimum commercial threshold that the Rodale Press publication had cited as necessary for a viable sale. He sat with the number for a moment. Then he closed the ledger and went inside to use the telephone. Calhoun Vesper answered on the second ring, and Harlan gave him the final yield number without preamble. There was a pause on the California end of the line. Then Vesper asked if Harlan could hold the seed for approximately 1 week while he arranged transport. Harlan said he could. 4 days later, Vesper called back. He asked if Harlan had additional seed available beyond the contracted lot. A second buyer, a distributor in San Francisco, that had been trying to enter the chia market for the better part of a year, had contacted Western Pacific Natural Foods after hearing through trade channels that they had located a domestic source. Vesper was attempting to fill 2 orders simultaneously and was running short of supply. Harlan said he had what he had. "Is there any way you could put in more acreage next season?" Vesper asked. Harlan considered this for a moment. He thought about the northeast field, the 60 acres that had cracked open in July, under a drought that everyone in Deaf Smith County had agreed was the worst in recent memory, and that had produced in response to that drought a crop that no extension agent had recommended, and no neighboring operator had attempted, and no USDA program had anticipated. He thought about 120 acres. "I'll consider it," he said. He hung up the telephone and stood for a moment in the farm office with the brown ledger open on the desk in front of him and the cracked leather satchel on the shelf above it, and the particular quality of October light coming through the east-facing window, long and pale, falling across the desk at an angle that made the ledger's cover look almost amber. He picked up a pencil. Below the yield number he had written on the evening of the 4th day, he added a new line. "Second buyer inquiry, expanded acreage request, 1964 decision pending." He wrote it in the same compressed shorthand he used for everything. Factual, undramatic recording, what had happened without editorial comment, the way his father had taught him to record things. Then he closed the ledger and went back to wait for the California truck. It arrived on November 2nd, a flatbed with California plates driven by a man who introduced himself only by the company name on his paperwork and who said very little beyond what the transaction required. He was methodical in his own way. He unloaded the commercial platform scale he had brought with him and weighed each of the 12 burlap sacks himself before signing the bill of lading. He did not question Harlan's weights from the certified farm scale. He simply weighed each sack himself, recorded the numbers on his own clipboard, and compared them to Harlan's figures when he was done. They matched within 2 pounds across the full lot. The driver signed the bill of lading, handed Harlan his copy, and gave him the check. Then he loaded the 12 sacks onto the flatbed, tied them down with practiced efficiency, and drove back down the county road toward Hereford and the highway that would take him west. Harlan stood at the gate and watched the truck until it was out of sight. The California plate had been visible until the last turn in the road. Then it was gone and the county road was empty again, and the northeast field lay behind him in the November light, 60 acres of bare post-harvest stubble, the chia cut to its root crowns, the soil already beginning to show the first faint difference in color that comes when a deep-rooted crop has broken the surface crust and begun the slow work of changing what lies beneath. He looked at the check. It was drawn on a Bank of America account in Los Angeles. The amount was $661.20. He folded it once and put it in his shirt pocket and walked back to the house. Nora was standing on the porch when he came around the corner of the barn. She had been inside when the truck arrived, and she had not come out during the loading and weighing and signing. She understood without needing to be told that there are transactions a man needs to complete on his own terms. He handed her the check. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. The November air moved across the porch between them, carrying the smell of cut chia stubble and cold dirt, and the particular cleanness that comes to the panhandle when the growing season is fully done and the land has closed its account with the year. That covers the seed cost, and a little more, she said finally. Plus 60 acres in production instead of fallow, Harlan said. And Vesper wants the same acreage or more next year. Minimum 58 cents, possibly better. Nora looked at the check again. Then she looked out at the northeast field, the bare brown stubble standing in the afternoon light, quiet and stubborn, the way things look after they have done what they were always going to do and are now simply waiting for the next season to begin. She did not ask about the $14,000 note at First Territorial Bank. She had known about that note for years, had known about its terms and its due date, and the gap between what the Bowen farm could produce in a drought year and what the bank would require on October 15th. She had done the arithmetic on the $661 check, and she understood exactly what it covered and what it did not cover. But she had been married to Harlan Bowen for 34 years, and in those 34 years, she had learned to recognize the specific quality of stillness that settled over him when a situation was not yet finished, when there were elements in motion that had not yet arrived at their conclusion, that he had set in motion deliberately and was now simply waiting on. She handed the check back to him. He put it in his pocket. They stood on the porch together in the November light. Then Nora went inside and Harlan sat on the porch steps and looked at the northeast field until the light went. The call from Prescott Dunwell came on the morning of November 8th. Dunwell's voice on the telephone carried the particular quality of a man who is saying one thing while meaning something adjacent to it. Careful neutral, stripped of any inflection that might reveal the specific pressure under which he was operating. He did not say anything about the Texas State Banking Commission. He did not say anything about the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas or the registered letter that Harlan had sent in August or the inquiry that had been opened in response to it. He said that the bank had been reviewing Harlan's account in light of recent developments and that there was an opportunity to discuss a restructuring of the existing note on terms that would be more workable for both parties. Harlan said he would come in on Thursday. He drove to Hereford on a gray November morning and sat across from Prescott Dunwell in the branch manager's office and listened to what the bank was prepared to offer. The maturity date on the note would be extended to March 1st, 1964. The interest rate would be adjusted to reflect the correct maximum permissible under Texas Banking Code Section 5.02. The bank would accept Harlan's signed supply contract with Western Pacific Natural Foods for the 1964 chia crop, 120 acres projected at the current price as additional collateral. And the principal balance on the note, Dunwell said, with the careful neutrality of a man reading from a document he would have preferred not to exist, would be adjusted to reflect a mandatory credit arising from a regulatory finding. He said the new number, $8,580. The Texas State Banking Commission had completed its preliminary review and issued its finding. First Territorial Bank of Hereford had charged interest in excess of the maximum allowable rate under Texas Banking Code Section 5.02 in each year from 1960 through 1962. The required remedy was a credit of 3 times the total overcharged amount against the outstanding principal. The bank had also been assessed a regulatory fine of $750, which was the maximum the code permitted. Dunwell did not explain any of this. He simply read the adjusted balance from his document and described the restructured terms and slid a signature page across the desk. Harlan read the restructured note from the first line to the last. He checked the interest rate calculation against the figure he had derived from the banking code himself. He confirmed the new maturity date. He confirmed the collateral language. Then he picked up the pen and signed. He did not thank Prescott Dunwell. He drove home on US 60 in the November afternoon. He parked at the gate and sat in the truck for a moment with the engine off and the last of the day's light coming flat across the property from the west. Then he went inside and found Nora in the kitchen and told her the note had been restructured. She asked what the new balance was. He told her. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said she would put supper on. Word moved through Smith County the way it always moved. Not through any formal channel, but through the grain elevator at the county co-op on a Thursday morning, where a man who had seen the California truck told the story to another man, who told Sid Harlow, who told Vern Oakes, who told his wife, who mentioned it to Curtis Lane's wife at church on Sunday. By the following Tuesday, 3 men had driven slowly past the Bowen property on the county road to look at the harvested northeast field, which told them nothing except that the ground was bare and the storage bins were closed. Curtis Lane came to the fence line on a Wednesday afternoon in the first week of November. Harlan was draining the transmission on the Model M for winter storage when Lane's pickup stopped at the gate. Lane rolled down his window. "Heard you sold that chia seed," he said. Harlan kept his hands on the drain plug fitting. "Did," he said. "What did it come out to?" Harlan wiped his hands on the shop rag. "Enough," he said. "Enough to cover the note." "The note is between me and the bank," Harlan said. He turned back to the transmission housing. Lane sat at the gate for another moment. Then he drove away. Vern Oakes, for his part, had planted 50 acres of dryland wheat in September that was already showing stress from the same aquifer depletion that had destroyed Harlan's sorghum in July. Sid Harlow had followed Aldous Farrick's recommendation and fallowed his affected acreage, collected his $246 in set-aside payments, and used it to patch the roof of his equipment shed, which did not leave enough for anything else. Neither man said anything directly to Harlan about any of this, but Harlan heard through the same informal channels that carried everything in Smith County that Oakes had asked at the co-op whether anyone knew what kind of seed Harlan Bowen had put in that cracked northeast ground. And he heard that Harlow had driven into Hereford on a Tuesday and asked Aldous Farrick at the extension office about drought-tolerant seed crops. Farrick apparently had no information to provide. Aldous Farrick drove out to the Bowen property on December 12th. It was a cold afternoon. The sky, the flat pale white of a high plains December, and the harvested northeast field showed nothing from the road except bare stubble and the faint tire tracks of the California truck still pressed into the soil at the field entrance where the flatbed had turned in. Harlan was in the barn when he heard the vehicle on the gravel. He was adjusting the spring tension on the feed gate of the broadcast cedar attachment, the one his father had fabricated from steel channel in 1939, using a torque wrench and a length of baling wire, and the particular patience that equipment maintenance requires when you are working on something old and hand-built and irreplaceable. Farrick knocked at the open barn door. He was holding his hat in both hands in front of him. Harlan set the torque wrench on the bench and looked at him. Farrick said, "I gave you wrong advice in July." He said it plainly without qualification or self-justification, which Harlan respected more than he would have respected an explanation. A man who explains his mistakes at length is usually more interested in your understanding of his circumstances than in the fact of the mistake itself. Farrick simply stated it. "I didn't have the information," Farrick said. "No," Harlan said. "Where did you get it?" Harlan looked at him for a moment. "My father had a paper from 1924, he said. A botanical survey. Delum, Texas Land and Soil Commission." Farrick took a small notebook from his breast pocket and wrote the name. He asked if he could see the document. Harlan went to the farm office and came back with the Delum carbon copy still inside the cracked leather satchel. He handed it to Farrick without comment. Farrick read it standing in the barn doorway with the cold December air moving around his ankles and the flat winter light coming in over his shoulder. He read slowly with the attention of a man who is genuinely reading rather than performing the act of reading. When he reached pages 7 and 8, he slowed down further, and Harlan could see him reading certain passages a second time. "I'd want to write this up for the extension bulletin," Farrick said when he had finished. "As a case study, drought-tolerant seed crop production on high plains dryland acreage." "That's your business," Harlan said. He took the Delum document back when Farrick handed it over. He returned it to the satchel, and the satchel to the shelf in the farm office. Then he came back to the barn and picked up the torque wrench and resumed working on the spring tension of the feed gate. Farrick stood in the doorway for another moment. Then he put his hat back on and walked to his vehicle and drove back down the county road toward Hereford. Farrick published his 2-page article in the Smith County Extension Bulletin in March of 1964. He cited the Dellum survey by name, described the broadcast seeding method and seed source and harvest timing and buyer contact information in enough detail that any producer in the county could replicate the process. He identified the grower only as a producer in the northeast part of the county, which was as specific as Harlan would have wanted and as anonymous as the story could reasonably be told while still being useful to anyone who needed it. The Texas A&M Agricultural Extension Service reprinted the relevant section in its statewide quarterly in June of 1964. By the fall of that year, 4 other producers in Deaf Smith and neighboring counties had planted chia on a combined total of 310 acres using the buyer contact information Farrick had published to reach Western Pacific Natural Foods and a second California distributor that had entered the market after Vesper's first domestic purchase the previous year. None of those 4 producers knew Harlan Bowen's name. 2 of them had been told about the crop by Aldous Farrick himself at an extension meeting at the county courthouse in January of 1964, where Farrick had stood at the front of a room of 32 farmers and described the requirements and the method and the buyer contact and the yield data, all of it drawn from 12 pages of faded typescript that had spent 40 years in a cracked leather satchel on a shelf in a converted grain bin on the Bowen property. Vern Oakes was one of the men in that room. He planted 35 acres of chia in the spring of 1964 on the dryland acreage he leased from the county near the Playa Lakes south of Hereford. He harvested 630 pounds that October and sold them to the San Francisco distributor at 55 cents per pound. He told his wife that evening that he should have listened to Harlan Bowen in the summer of 1963. She said he should have. He never said this directly to Harlan. Harlan, for his part, planted 120 acres of chia in the spring of 1964 as contracted. Vesper had renegotiated the price upward to 61 cents per pound after laboratory testing confirmed that the 1963 Bowen crop had exceeded the purity levels of the existing Mexican supply by a measurable margin, lower moisture content, higher seed density, more consistent sizing. These were not accidental qualities. They were the natural result of a crop grown in conditions precisely suited to the plant's requirements under the management of a man who had understood those conditions before he planted a single seed. The 1964 harvest came to 2,160 pounds across 120 acres. Combined with a partial recovery from the grain sorghum acreage that had been able to return to limited production after the drought year, had partially recharged its moisture profile, the 1964 season produced the first operating surplus Harlan had recorded in 3 years. It was not a large surplus, but it was real, and it was documented in the Brown Ledger in the same compressed shorthand as everything else, and it pointed in a direction that the previous 3 years had not. In November of 1964, he drove to Hereford and paid $2,000 against the principal of the restructured note at First Territorial Bank. Prescott Dunwell processed the payment without comment. Harlan drove home on US 60 with the windows down, even though it was November, because the air coming off the Llano Estacado smelled like cold and distance. And he had always driven with the windows down when the air smelled like that, ever since he was a young man first learning to read this particular stretch of highway, and the sky above it, and the land on both sides of it that went on in every direction farther than a person could see. Leland Bowen came home for Thanksgiving in 1964. He was 19 years old and finishing his first full year of agricultural studies at Texas Tech in Lubbock, and he had his father's quality of paying attention to things without appearing to pay attention to them, a kind of absorption that looked from the outside like ordinary presence, but was actually something more deliberate. On the morning after Thanksgiving, Harlan and Leland walked the harvested chia ground together. In the pale November light, their breath showing in the cold air moving through the post-harvest stubble of the northeast field, in the particular silence that exists between a father and a son who do not need to fill silence with conversation. Leland asked why they still kept the 1948 John Deere Model M when the farm had newer and more capable equipment. Harlan stopped walking and pressed his boot into the stubble. "It runs," he said. Leland looked at the Model M through the open barn door, the oxidized red paint, the fabricated cedar attachment sitting on the concrete floor beside it, the green ledger on the barn wall with its decades of entries. The rented 402 could do this field in half the time, he said. Renting costs money, Harlan said. He turned and walked back toward the barn. Leland stood in the field for a moment longer. Then he followed his father into the barn and lifted the green ledger from its hook on the wall. He opened it to the first page, which was dated April 3rd, 1931, the same spring his grandfather Roy had handed over the tractor keys, and told Harlan to disc the south pasture before supper. He read forward through the decades of entries. The handwriting changed at 1951 from his grandfather's angular script to his father's smaller, more compressed hand. The information did not change dates, part numbers, service intervals, notes on anything requiring adjustment, all of it consistent and continuous across 32 years, as if the ledger were a single document written by two men who thought about their work in exactly the same way. He turned to September of 1963. The entry was for the replacement of the feed gate spring on the broadcast cedar attachment part number torque specification date of completion, written in pencil in his father's hand at the end of an entry that otherwise looked identical to every other entry in the ledger. There was nothing about what the cedar attachment was going to be used for 2 weeks later. There was nothing about 60 acres of cracked northeast field or a botanical survey from 1924 or a purchase letter from a California natural foods company. There was only the part number and the torque specification and the date recorded with the same precision and the same absence of drama as every other entry for 32 years. Leland put the ledger back on its hook. He stood beside his father while Harlan worked through the carburetor check on the Model M, his hands moving over the brass fittings with the careful, habitual pressure of a man who has performed this inspection on the 1st of October for more than 3 decades, and whose hands know exactly what they are looking for without requiring instruction from his conscious mind. "You knew it would work," Leland said. It was not quite a question. Harlan wiped his hands on the shop rag and looked at the carburetor housing for a moment before answering. "Dellum knew it would work," he said. "I just read it." They stood together in the barn without speaking. Outside, the November light was going thin and long across the Bowen property, across the equipment shed, and the storage bins, and the farm office in its converted grain bin, and the fence lines that his grandfather Ezra had run by hand across ground that had been in this family since 1908. And out in the northeast field, the bare post-harvest stubble of 60 acres of chia stood in that fading light quiet and finished with its season. Below the surface in the soil that the drought had cracked, and the roots had followed downward, and the seasons had begun slowly to rebuild, something was taking place that no one walking past on the county road would have been able to see. The organic matter content of that soil was rising. The structure of it was improving. The fracture lines that the drought had opened, the same fracture lines that had delivered water to the roots that had followed them down, were being filled gradually with the residue of the root systems themselves, with the slow biological process that turns dead roots into the dark material that holds moisture and feeds the next generation of whatever grows in it. A Texas A&M extension study would document this 3 years later, surveying 17 High Plains farms that had transitioned drought-affected acreage into chia production. The Bowen Northeast field would show the highest organic matter increase of any site in the study. The study would cite the parcel by number. Harlan's name would not appear. He would not have wanted it to. In July of 1963, a man had stood in a field cracked open by the worst drought in recent county memory on ground that held a $14,000 debt against it and 96 days to the due date. And he had read those cracks not as damage but as preparation. He had read them the way his father had taught him to read everything, with the assumption that what the land was doing had a logic to it, and that the logic was worth understanding before you decided what to do next. The drought had not destroyed the field. The drought had made the field ready for the only crop that had ever been shaped across generations of selection in places exactly like this, to grow in ground exactly like this. What looked like an ending was a set of conditions. And the man who understood those conditions did what he had always done. He went to the barn. He checked the oil on a machine that everyone else considered obsolete. He opened a 40-year-old document and read it until he understood what it was telling him. And then he began.